Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ellie. Thank you. Nice to see everybody here this morning. Back to our regular Tuesday morning slot. And nice to see everyone here. Debbie, good morning, Debbie. Nice to see you. Dina, nice to see you guys. Love to see you. Nice to see all our regular participants. Judith, nice to see you. Good morning, Judith. Where's the baby? I'm used to seeing you with a baby.
I gotta go get her. She's over there.
All right, let her stay there. Let her stay there. It's good.
Yeah.
Okay, we've been looking at major themes in Sefer Bereshis, and we've reached a point, a crucial crossroads. There are several crucial crossroads in Sefer Bereshis, and this is one of them. And this is the transition from chapter 11 to chapter 12, which is basically the transition from pre-Avraham Avinu to the life of Avraham Avinu. And in a sense, all the first 11 chapters of Bereshis, the first 11, are, from a Jewish point of view, they're not really history, they're prehistoric. It's a very interesting concept in all fields of history. What is considered historical and what is considered prehistorical? Because in fact, this is an arbitrary decision, really, to decide that something is prehistoric. But what it means, prehistoric, means that the events that we are familiar with and that we consider to be significant haven't happened yet. And the first 11 chapters of the Torah are really laying the foundations in order that we can start building the building which will become Klal Yisrael, right? But we get human nature, the Adam and Chava and their activities, and Cain and Hevel, and Noach and the Mabul and the building of the Migdal Bovel. All these give us the building blocks of what human nature and human culture looked like prior to Avraham Avinu. And we're going to be looking at the Rambam, how he describes it. We're looking at it in a few minutes, in order to get a little bit of a sense of how the whole enterprise of Avraham Avinu got off the ground. But there's nothing really more powerful or more exciting in the whole of Sefer Bereshis than Avraham Avinu appearing on the scene. We are just so familiar with it. We know it since we were kids, and it's so much part of our ABC of life. We don't really appreciate the massive spiritual revolution that Avraham Avinu masterminded. I think I mentioned to you a very nice, a good line of Rabbi Sachs, Zechron Livracha, my good friend and colleague, which he often said, which is particularly relevant to the beginning of the life of Avraham Avinu. He used to say that one of the secrets of the Torah is the power of the idea. That if you have an idea and you understand that idea properly, and you work through that idea, an idea can change your life, and an idea can change the world. And in the non-Jewish world, they don't really focus so much on, this is the way he put it, very cleverly, they don't really focus so much on the power of the idea, they focus on the idea of power. In other words, in the non-Jewish world, if you read history books, it's about this powerful king fighting battles against that powerful king, and building this country, building this army, and how power developed, economic power, military power, all sorts of different power sources, right? They consider that to be the shapers of history in the non-Jewish world. In the Jewish world, this was his fantastic line, we don't believe in the idea of power, we believe in the power of the idea. And nothing illustrates this more clearly than the life of Avraham Avinu, who had no power at all. In fact, he starts off at the beginning of Lech Lecha as an immigrant who has no land and no wealth. and no family and no army and no signs of any power whatsoever, but he's got an idea. And that idea is emunah. That's the idea. The idea is that we're living in God's world, and that obligates us to live a particular type of life, particularly in the field of chesed. And this was Avram's one idea. And with that one idea, he revolutionized his generation and actually laid the foundations for revolutionizing the world and the way people feel and think in the world today. And Rabbi Sachs is very fond of speaking about the Abrahamic, I think it was a bit of a chiddush of his to use the word Abraham as an adjective, to change the name into an adjective, sort of Abrahamic ideas and Abrahamic views. And he would speak about the Abrahamic roots of Christianity and Islam. And when he spoke to Christian and Muslim leaders, he would focus on that. He would focus on our commonality of Abrahamic views, right? That we're all in some way. That's why I had to smile a little bit when these recent political accords with the United Arab Emirates were called the what were they called? Abrahamic Accords or something. They were called Abraham's Accords. I'm not sure exactly what word they used, but they were Abrahamic, right? It's interesting. In other words, it's an agreement which connects people who are basically not at all friends of each other, the Arab world and the Jewish world, but there is a hope for some commonality between us because of Avraham. Because of Avraham. And that is a most extraordinary thought, that the power of that idea of Avraham Avinu really still remains in the minds of basically half of mankind, right? Half of the people on this globe have some ideas in their head, which one could, if you attribute to biblical ideas, either through Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, and an idea of Abraham, which he turned around to a pagan world and said, no, there is one God, and he is the creator. Incidentally, I just want to, I don't know if I mentioned this to you before, I had some strong connections in London with some Hindu Indians who were firm Hindu believers, from Hindus, who were not only being from Hindus, they were also very knowledgeable Hindus, right? And I don't know if I mentioned this to you before, but it is interesting that actually it could be that the influence of Avraham Avinu extended even to the Far East, because in my discussions with this fellow, he is the son of one of the Gedolei Hador of the Hindus in India. So his son grew up in a sort of a very knowledgeable Hindu context, and he was part of the Brahmans. Anyone familiar with that word? The Brahmans, B-R-A-H-M-A-N. The elite, basically, Lahavdil, the Kohanim of the Hindus are called the Brahmans, B-R-A-H-M-A-N, which some people have suggested has certainly got a phonetic relationship to the word Avraham. The Brahmins are connected to Avraham in a certain way, and the Brahmins are only really, I think, 0.5% of the Hindu Indian nation. And when I spoke to him about various things, he spoke about the fact that he considers himself to be a servant of God, of the one God. So I said to him, but I thought that the Hindus believed in a multitude of various different deities and different gods, because Hinduism certainly has all the appearances of a pagan belief, right? The god of rain and the god of darkness, the god of fertility, and they pray to the god of this and the god of that and the god of the other, and they have a whole range of deities. So he said, yes, he said, but us, the Brahmins, right? We know the truth that there's one God. this idea of all the different deities, that's for the Hamoin Am. That's Hinduism for the masses. Hinduism for the masses speaks about all these different gods and deities because they can't grasp the abstract concept of one God and being a servant of one God. But the Brahmins do believe in one God, which I thought was quite fascinating, which means that at some point in Hinduism, there is, in other words, Avodah Zarah does somehow disappear once you drill down deeper into Hinduism, and there is a belief among some of them in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in one God, the Creator, despite all the different pagan aspects of Hinduism. I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but it's very interesting. We got into this conversation by discussing tzitzis. He noticed my tzitzis, right? Which are pretty big, my tzitzis, as a matter of fact, and also a bit more interesting because they got tcheles, they're all colorful and everything. So at a certain point, he said to me, this was actually a senior doctor, one of the senior doctors in the medical world in the UK. He said to me, would you like to see mine? I said, what? Tzitzis? I'm sure you haven't got tzitzis. So he opens his shirt and he had on his skin, it wasn't a beged, he had on his skin 6 threads with knots on them around like a sash, wearing a sash which was underneath his vest. That was his vest. And he told me the name of these strings, which was had about 25 letters to it, long Indian name. But he said, if you want to, you can Google and look up Brahman Strings. And Brahman Strings is the Hindu equivalent of tzitzis. But it's worn only by the Brahmins. So I said, but what's the point of these strings? So he says, the point of these strings is to remind me that I'm a servant of God. So I thought, it's an extraordinary thing, cross-cultural. Hinduism grew up, and it's interesting, if you look historically when Hinduism began, it's pretty much equivalent with Avram Avinu, because we're talking about 4,000 years ago, right? That's when they started. That's when the religion began. And somehow these ideas of Avram actually, possibly, this is all speculation, I don't document or anything documenting this, but there are certainly indications that this emunah that Avram had, in addition to the root that we're all familiar with through Judaism, the Torah, and then afterwards into Christianity and Islam, also actually affected the Far East. And there was a connection to the Far East. And all this is just explaining the what Rabbi Sachs refers to as the power of an idea. An idea powerfully understood and powerfully transmitted can actually change the world. And this is Avram Avinu. We're now going to have a look at the first psukim of chapter 12. And let's see if I can do a screen share just for a minute. How are we doing, Ellie? Can you see something? Yes, good. Okay, so I think the first pasuk in Bereshit in Lech Lecha is familiar to many of us, right? What does the pasuk say? Vayom Hashem el Avram, Lech Lecha me'artzecha mimoladtecha mibeis avicha el haaretz asher areka. Go from your native land. What was his native land? Was Mesopotamia, right? The other side of the river Euphrates, and go and leave it all behind and go where should he go? And here's an interesting thing: he doesn't tell him where to go to. He goes El Haaretz Asher Areka, which basically means go in this direction, and when you get there, you will know that you've arrived. Very interesting statement of the Chumash from the very beginning. But before we look at the statement, what's interesting to notice is that this is in fact the very first nevuah of Avraham Avinu. And we see in a few psukim later on that at this point, does anybody know how old Avraham is at this point in the narrative? How old is he? Anybody know?
75.
75 years old. It's an interesting question mark here. The Ramban speaks about it, the Malbim. It's very fascinating that the Torah tells us nothing about Avraham Avinu before the age of 75. And at the age of 75, he's already a Novi, right? He's already a person who is able to receive and respond to prophecy, to Nevuah. And we're not told in the Chumash anything. Now, the Midrashim, in the Torah Baal Peh, there was a whole tradition about Avraham Avinu's growing up and his youth and what he did and who persecuted him and Ur cussed him, that he was thrown in the furnace and Nimrod, all the different things that happened to him in his earlier life. But I think it's very interesting that the Torah starts only with this Nevuah. It's almost as if the Torah is saying, this book, the Chumash, is actually not a storybook. It's not a history book, in essence. It's a book about the development of the neshama and the development of the Nevuah and the interaction between God and man. That's what the Torah is about. What did HaKadosh Baruch Hu say to mankind, and how mankind were able to live a life in compliance with HaKadosh Baruch Hu's instructions. And this all begins here with Avraham Avinu. We saw earlier, didn't we, in Bereshis and Noach, that many of the instructions that were given, for example, to Adam, were not a great success. It's true, Noach did obey and build the ark, but he also failed in many ways, Noach. Noach was an ish tzaddik, but he wasn't a total success in many ways. Primarily, he was a spectacular failure at educating his generation. But Avram is given here his very first nevuah, and he's told, Lech lecha. And the lecha is also very interesting, right? He could have just been said, Avram, Lech me'artzecha mi'baladzecha beis avicha. Lech would have been perfectly good. What is the Lech lecha? Lech lecha, right? So this is a very fascinating expression in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's talking to Avraham Avinu, and it occurs again. Does anyone know where the second time of Lech Lecha is used with Avraham Avinu? It's at the Akedah. So Lech Lecha al Eretz HaMoiriah. Avraham Avinu is told, right, at the end of Parshas Vayera, the Lech Lecha al Eretz HaMoiriah. So the Lech Lecha it certainly has deeper significance to it. Doesn't just mean, what does it mean, go for yourself? We'll see in a minute. Avraham Avinu is not going for himself. He's going because the HaKadosh Baruch Hu instructed him to go. In fact, as Rashi points out, this journey was a great sacrifice on Avram's part. It's interesting, Rashi here at the beginning of Lech Lecha, where Rashi says, immigrating from one country to another creates a great loss. Creates loss of finance, loss of comfort, loss of connections, loss of people. And I'm speaking now here to a group of people here in this Shia who, like myself, have experienced, I think, what to immigrate means. We've all immigrated. And I think we've all felt, I certainly have felt along the way, that it's a sacrifice. Every time you immigrate, it's a sacrifice. You do give up. You give up connections with people who you love. You give up comforts. You give up income. You give up status. There's a lot of sacrifice involved in the procedure of Lech, right? And it's certainly all very much worthwhile. But I think even when a sacrifice is worthwhile, it's important to remember that you have sacrificed a fair amount. You know, you have to know that. You have to have a little light on in your brain, which is, I've left all that behind, and that's painful, and that's difficult for me, and I miss it. It's all worthwhile. In the bigger, in the larger reference, it was definitely the right thing to do. But I'm certainly missing certain things, and as a result of which it impacts on our lives, on a practical level, on a spiritual level, on a emotional level. You lose out an enormous amount. And that's really what HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying to Avraham Avinu. If you look at Rashi here, Rashi says, Lech lecha, I promise you that all the things that you sacrifice, and that will be worthwhile. When you come to the end of it, you will see that it wasn't really a sacrifice, it was an investment. But along the way, it feels like a sacrifice, and it is a sacrifice. It is a sacrifice. Everybody knows that, right? And I'm not just talking about money, loss of money, loss of comforts and pleasures and one thing and another, but on a deeper level as well. Somebody has given me here a whole list of hot salt beef sandwiches and Brent Cross and various other luxuries in life, which are difficult to get hold of here, right? That's at one end of the spectrum. That's certainly true. Lots of different conveniences and pleasures which we took for granted. The cars that we drove and the shops that we bought in and the income that we had, all the things, all the parts of life we had to give up. But that sacrifice makes the Lech Lecha to Eretz Yisrael just so much more valuable, that we've actually given up a lot for it. I think many people who've grown up in Israel don't fully realize to what extent Olim Chadashim have sacrificed in order to come to live in Israel. But that's not important one way or another. But it is important that we are aware of it and we understand that that is a process that we went through, and the strength, and here's an interesting point, the strength that we have to go through that sacrifice in order to come to the land of Israel, that strength we got from Avram Avinu. Avram Avinu was the first man who did Lech Lecha, the first man who came on Aliyah and left it all behind. Moladcha, Beis Avicha, right? Artzecha, Moladcha, Beis Avicha, everything that you had, the land, the fields, the properties, the houses, everything you had behind. It's actually very fascinating to think about it for a minute, that immigrating in earlier generations was nothing like, imagine changing countries, moving from one country to another, but there are no bank accounts and there are no credit cards, and there's nothing of the financial system that we have today. You arrive as an immigrant basically with what you've got in your pockets and what you've got on your back, the shirt on your back. You arrive with nothing, right? You have to start again completely from scratch, especially in the ancient world where 90% of wealth was based on land ownership, right? So when you move, you're completely zero land ownership. And you have to start again from scratch. And anyone who's ever spoken to people who are refugees, who had to get out quickly, people who had to leave Germany in the late 30s, like my mother, Zichron Lebracha, arrived in England without a single penny. Nothing. She had a small bag, and that was it. Not a single penny in the world. And immigration, and so that's what Avraham Avinu is doing. I'm just mentioning this, that his Lech Lecha is not, he doesn't travel business class, and he doesn't just transfer his account and his credit card from one place to another. He arrives penniless, right? And he has to start from scratch, but he's got an idea. He's got an idea. Idea here is that he has a connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God the Creator, who hears his tefillos, who in his case also gives him a prophecy, and he also has the idea of that there is on planet Earth a special land. The whole of Lech Lecha is focused on the principle that there is a land of Israel on the globe which is unlike all other lands, and that's the place you've got to go to. Do not continue your life's work in Aram Naharayim, on the banks of the river Euphrates. You've got to go to the land of Israel. That's where you can develop this idea of emunah and avodas Hashem. The land of Israel is uniquely the place to do it. Why? Difficult to know why, but that's the way God created the world. And he says to him, leave it all behind and go to the land that I see. Let's get back to the text for a minute, because there's some very interesting stuff here. Right. So he says, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises him, I'll make you into a great nation. Incidentally, he doesn't yet say to him that he will have children. He doesn't yet give him a bracha of children. He'll become a great nation could easily mean, say the Mefarshim here, that you will have many followers, that you will be able to build a nation out of your disciples and your followers. Right? And I will bless you, and I will make your name great. I will make your name great. In other words, the idea that you are teaching and the message that you are giving will be disseminated in the world. Incidentally, there's another, of course, meaning to the word Agadla Shemecha, which means that Avram's name, Aleph Beis Reish Mem, was expanded, that his name was made greater, that his name became Aleph Reish, right? Hey, right? His name became Avraham, not Avram. At this point, he's still Avram. Agadla Shemecha means I will add a letter to your name. Exactly what the significance of that is, massive significance. But interestingly, the letter Hey is in more mystical writings is often associated, among other things, with having children, with childbirth, right? And therefore, Avram and Sarai, neither of them had a letter Hey in their name, but after they each got a letter Hey added, then they were able to have children. And indeed, there were certain Kabbalists and Kabbalistic writings who say that when you give a name to a girl, you should try, if possible, to give her a name which contains the letter Hey, because the letter Hey is a segula of some sort for childbirth. So Avram and Sarai are childless without having the letter Hey. Once they get the letter Hey, this enables them to have Yitzchak. Now, I'm not a Kabbalist, as I've mentioned to you several times before, but there are some very beautiful and interesting ideas in the more mystical side of Torah. And the idea of the letter Hey and childbirth is a very fascinating one. And I know cases of Rabbanim, etc., who have changed people's names when they had difficulty having children, and the letter Hey always focuses in that. Interestingly, that the letter Hey in the Torah is written as a daled, right? A daled. And then at the bottom left-hand corner is a little upside-down yud. And the Mekubalim speak about the upside-down yud as the upside-down baby in the uterus. The little yud, which is upside down. It's an extraordinary thing that the baby has to come out upside down, right? The upside down yud is the upside down baby in the uterus. The uterus is the daled, is the container, if you like, and the yud is the little baby which is conceived within the daled. And the yud, of course, represents the neshama, represents the spiritual force of the human being. Someone's just mentioned here, of course, Yitzchak is also born after Avraham has a bris milah, but we're jumping the gun a little bit on that. We'll come to that, please God, in due course. I'm really just commenting on the word Va'agadla Shemech. Your name is Avram, which Avram literally means the exalted father. Ram means exalted, and Av means the father, meaning the leader, meaning the teacher, right? Avram, the exalted teacher, but Avraham, right, the Hey. So later on, the Pasuk will say that the word Hey relates to the word Hamon Goyim. Av Hamon Goyim. That you will become the leader of many nations, right? And as I mentioned to you before, Avram is in many ways the leader. In other words, his ideas became the foundational ideas of many nations, not only of Klal Yisrael, primarily, of course, Klal Yisrael, but also of other nations. It's interesting, incidentally, that the Rambam mentions in one place that even though we, the Jewish people, have suffered enormously over the generations, both from the Christians and the Muslims, right? The Rambam was aware of the Crusaders and the massive damage they had done, and he himself suffered from the Muslim extremists. But he says, if we can zoom out from our suffering and take a bigger picture, the bigger picture is that Christianity and Islam have done a service to mankind because they have spread around the world the idea of God the Creator. That there is one God, and He's God the Creator, and He hears our prayers, and we are accountable to that one God. That idea, right, has been distributed around the world by Christianity and Islam for at least over 1,000 years, close to 2,000 years, and the Rambam sees that as part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's laying the foundations for the ultimate Bias HaMoshiach. In other words, if Yemos HaMoshiach relates not just to the Jewish people but also to mankind, they have to have some sort of basic vocabulary to understand that there is a God to whom we are accountable. There is a one God, and all other gods, and Ein Od Milvado. That idea of Ein Od Milvado has been distributed among the nations. So Avram becomes later on Av Hamod Goyim, and we're going to look at that more closely. But here, Agad L'Shemecha, and here comes an interesting word also here. V'heyei Baruch. So first of all, he says, Avoracheka means I will bless you. So God is saying to Avraham Avinu, I am bestowing upon you a bracha. So what does V'heyei Baruch mean more than V'avoracheka? What does it mean to be a bracha? To be blessed is to be the recipient of a bracha is one thing he's told. So what could it mean to be a bracha? Anybody offers?
I would say that his bracha, he personally has power to give bracha. And secondly, that bracha can extend to other people through their, say, kesher with him. Not just he's going to be blessed, but all those, the world.
Right. The idea of the bracha certainly relates to the idea of transmit. You'll be a transmitter of bracha. That you will in some way carry and transmit that bracha further. Have a look at 2 lines in Rashi. So Rashi says, V'hiyei bracha. The language of Rashi is very beautiful here. Rashi says, Habrachos nesunos b'yodecha. I'm giving you the brachas into your hands. Right? In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in some sense, is handing over to Avram the ability to generate brachas. Says Rashi, Ad achshav hayu biyodi. Until now, the concept of a bracha, the power of the bracha was in my hands, says HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Beirachti la'adam v'nayach. I, for example, gave a bracha to Adam and Chava and to Noach. But from now, Atal Tavorech Es Asher Tachbot. You can give a bracha to whoever you wish to. Right? So this idea of giving brachas and transmitting brachas is something uniquely that Avram is given, which has quite a lengthy history to it. That actually the Chazal speak about later on in the Chumash, when the Koyanim are given one of their mitzvahs, right, of Birkas Koyanim, something which in Chutz La'aretz we only got on Yom Tov, but here I get it every day, and on Shabbos twice, right? Kohanim work hard in Israel, much harder than in Chutz La'aretz. It was just a quick. On the other hand, in Chutz La'aretz, they used to sing a little bit, but here they don't. So whatever. But I call upon him that the whole idea of Kohanim giving the bracha, that is a special ability that Kohanim have, which links them to Avram Avinu. In other words, that power of Avram Avinu to distribute brachas, that power was later on devolved onto the Kohanim. They picked up that ability. The truth is, we all have the ability to give brachas, but the Kohanim specifically have the mitzvah to give brachas, and that is hinted at in the word koi, the word in Hebrew kaf hey. Right? Some of you might be aware that the word kaf hey appears in Birkas Kohanim, not in the words that you hear from the Kohanim, but in the Torah it says ko sevorachu es bnei Yisrael. This is the way to give the brachas. Koi, the word kaf hey. The Gemara learns out that kaf hey means many things. One of them means, for example, that Birkas Kohanim has to be given dafka in Lashon HaKodesh. There's something about the Hebrew words, right? Those 15 words of Yivrecha Hashem Yishmerecha, right? The 3, 5, and 7, the 3 psukim. First 3, then 5, then 7, is very, very meduyak. It's very, very carefully structured. Why those words, why that number of words, what those words mean. Kos Baruch means like this, exactly like this, right? However, Mepharshim say that the word Kos Baruch also links the Kohanim to Avraham Avinu. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we're going to see later on, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives Avraham Avinu. Avraham says, but I'm childless. What's going to be? I'm childless. The Pasuk says, Vayotze osa hachutza. He takes him outside, and what does he show him? Anyone remember? HaKadosh Baruch Hu shows Avraham Avinu the stars, right? Look at the stars. Look at the stars, and then he says, Ko yiyeh zarech. Like this, your children will be. Your children will be like this. Koi. So Chazal connect the Koi yiyeh zarech, the blessing of children to Avraham Avinu, to the Koi saboruchu as Bnei Yisrael. Now the Kohanim are actually fulfilling that role that Avraham Avinu was given, that he was given the power to transmit brachas to others. So that's the Rashi. Let's go a bit further. What does it mean by Agadlo Shamecha? So it's interesting. The Netziv writes something very interesting. The Netziv writes, Agadlo Shamecha, Afilu mi shelo yeh be'emunoso la'avod es Hashem ha'miyuchad. See, the Netziv says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying to Avraham Avinu, you will, of course, have real disciples who will accept upon themselves your teachings and become Ovdei Hashem, servants of God. But even those who haven't got the strength to receive your teachings properly, lo yeh k'mo sharei emunos shonos. It won't be like other beliefs, to chol kat mavaze or makrish or makchir emunah Hashem. Like that every group who has any beliefs sort of ridicules the beliefs of other people. So the Netziv says, like, Avraham got a special bracha that even those who are not actually followers of yours will still be admirers of yours. Because even those who don't become Jewish will still be admirers of Am Yisrael. They will recognize the uniqueness that the Jewish people have in mankind, even if they themselves can't join or don't want to join, they haven't got the strength to join in. So he says, the beliefs of Avraham are not like that. Even those who do not want to follow his belief, they know for certain that his belief in God is something massive, is something very powerful. something very precious. But it requires a lot of self-discipline to resist temptation in life in general. In other words, accepting upon yourself the life of Avraham Avinu requires a lot of self-discipline. Not everybody's willing to do that. So this is another aspect of the that HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises Avraham of his greatness, that he represented service of God, that even those who don't join him can still be admirers of him. And this has been something very interesting that has happened in history. There are many non-Jews, of course, who haven't converted to Judaism and haven't accepted upon themselves the Jewish faith. But when they speak about it, they recognize it's got something special. They realize it's got something quite unique about it. And indeed, the converse of that is when a non-Jew comes to convert, right? We try and discourage him or her. We try to discourage a potential convert because we say to them, look, it's actually very hard to live a life like that. Lots of converts start off by being admirers of the Jewish people. I've spoken to many dozens of them over my life. In my life, I've spoken to many people who are entering into the process of conversion, and they start off as admirers. And they admire Judaism so much, they want to convert. But that change is quite challenging. I don't know if any of you have ever spoken to people at that point, but it is something where they suddenly realize what sort of self-discipline and what sort of obligations they're accepting upon themselves. And that's why the Dayanim say to them, look, why would you want to take upon yourself all these restrictions and obligations, right? Why don't you just become a good moral and believing non-Jew? And that's also something wonderful. That's also something special. And the truth is, if you speak to most Dayanim in the world, they will tell you that they are perfectly aware of the fact that more than 50% of the people they convert to Judaism don't last in terms of their observance of Jewish life. In other words, only a minority actually make the course. Those that do last are very special individuals, people who've really got the idealism and the determination and the tenacity and the understanding, but more than 50% don't last, right? Yes, Judith, what do you want to add?
So I want to ask you, what is it about what Abraham was saying that made it so difficult? Because we didn't have the Torah yet. We don't have 613 mitzvahs. So what was he demanding of them to believe and to do that they didn't want to, they could admire, but they couldn't toe the line?
Yes. Okay, that's a good question. We don't know so much about what was actually the content of Avraham Avinu's teachings, other than to say it certainly included Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, which meant that a person had to have self-restraint, not to steal, right? Not to be violent, not to engage in adultery or incest. It did require a fair amount of self-discipline and a rejection of paganism and pagan gods and pagan practices. That's the Aleph base. The first thing Avraham is teaching certainly are the 7 Noachide laws. Beyond that, he's also teaching them to live a life of Kedusha, a life of recognizing that whatever they got comes from God, right? When Avraham Avinu invited guests into his house, he would give them food and give them hospitality. And then he would say to them, right, we're now going to thank God, the Creator, for everything that he's given us, right? And to live that sort of life needs a certain amount of humility and dedication and self-restraint. And I think that's what the Netziv is talking about. You're quite right. They haven't yet got Tariq mitzvahs. That's true.
And also, it's like all the things of the 7 mitzvahs of Noach. It's all for they could recognize that it's for their benefit. Like not to steal, not to murder, not to commit adultery. It seems like it's just so basic that they could accept such a thing.
Unit, it appears basic to you and me after 3,000 years of a evolved culture. But in the pagan world, it wasn't basic at all. Most of the pagan practices at the time in the world involved a lot of violence, a lot of promiscuity, and not at all self-discipline. It involved wild abandon and the worship of primal desires and primal needs. It was really, Avram was swimming against the stream. And he was saying, no, what I'm selling is a much more refined way of life, which requires self-discipline, which requires an awareness of living in God's world and a gratitude, living a life of gratitude to God for everything that he gives us. Yes, he didn't yet have Tariq mitzvahs, but there was still a fair amount of refinement in life, which was required. It's interesting. There are lots of places. There are lots of. I think this distinction that the Nativ makes is something that we can relate to. I think in lots of cases there are organizations, for example, that we don't belong to. For example, I was brought up as a Litvak, right? And I don't belong to any Hasidic groups or sects of any sort. And I have zero Hasidic practices or Hasidic garb or anything like that at all. But there are certain things the Hasidim do. You know, when I speak to Chabad Shalichim out in the middle of nowhere, connecting to Jews of all shapes and sizes, and I think about how they came to do that and what the Lubavitcher Rebbe did to inspire these people to go around the world, I'm an admirer. I'm a total admirer of the Lubavitcher Rebbe and of his goals and of how he succeeded. I'm not in any way a card-carrying member of the organization, but one can be an admirer without being a member. I think that's the point that I'm making, right? And I think there are lots of cases like that, where you see people doing things and you think that's extraordinary. That is really worthy of amazing praise. Do I want to do it? Not particularly. It's not for me to do. It doesn't fit with me, but nevertheless, they're doing amazing things.
It's like recognizing the truth in it. You can see
recognizing there's some truth there. Yes. I remember, just as a personal anecdote for a minute, I don't know why I'm telling you this, but I can't resist sometimes a personal footnote. When we started our shul Ner Yisrael, so we're talking about 1984, 85. So at a certain point, we had outgrown the initial premises which we were renting, and we needed to buy a property in Hendon. And even though the prices then, compared to what they are now, of course, is ridiculously small, but at the time, it looked like a lot of money, right? And we only had a small group. We had a group of about 50 families that were involved. And some people were willing to put up £1,000 to £2,000, maybe more, but we weren't getting even close until one Yid turned up and he spoke to me and he said, look, I do not intend to join your shul because I'm very happy in my shul and all my friends are in my shul. But I can see what you're doing and I am an admirer of what you're doing. And here's £50,000 to tell you how much I admire what you're doing. And in 1985, £50,000 was still quite a lot of money. And that made all the difference. With that money, we bought the premises where the shul is still there today. But it was interesting that he never joined the shul. He said, I don't plan to become a member of your shul. I'm not going to join because I'm happy where I am. But nevertheless, I admire what you're doing. And I thought that was quite interesting. And he was willing to put serious money on the table out of admiration. And I think that's true about all philanthropists in a certain sense. Many philanthropists support yeshivas or support organizations, which they don't plan to go and learn there. They don't plan to get involved in it, but they admire what is being done. So the Netziv says something very beautiful about the Jewish people in general. He says, you will find, he says, eventually, even those people who don't join the Jewish people will admire what Klal Yisrael stands for. And in actual fact, this comment of the Netziv I find interesting particularly because it's a bit of a forerunner of our vision of Yemos HaMoshiach. In the Messianic era, right? We say v'yeda kol pa'ul ki ata pa'alta v'yovin kol yotzu ki ata yitzarta, right? V'chein tein pachtcha Hashem Elokeinu hakol ma'asecha. And the whole of mankind will come to recognize what? Will they become Jewish? The answer is no. Mankind will not become Jewish, but mankind will admire and value what the Jewish people represent. And that, says the Netziv, what it means is v'agadla shemech. In other words, in the original blessing to Avraham Avinu is already hidden that garin, that little seed, right, of agadla shemecha, which only reaches its full fruition in the Messianic era, in Yemos HaMashiach. That agadla shemecha, that all the nations of the world will turn around and say, what is Yeshaya Hanavi says, that by Yemos HaMashiach, the nations of the world will say, Ki mitzion teitzei Torah or Devar Hashem Yerushalayim. That famous passage is not said by the Jews. That's said by the non-Jews. They recognize that the Devar Hashem comes from Yerushalayim. They're not converting. They're not becoming Klal Yisrael, but they are becoming God-fearing non-Jews who admire what the Jewish people represent. All that is contained in the original blessing to Avraham Avinu at the very first pasuk and the first stage of the building of the Jewish people. And then he says, I will bless those who bless you, and those who curse you will be cursed. I'm not going to go into that for the moment, but I am interested in this, the second half of the pasuk, where in a sense, Avraham Avinu is being given the what they call today the mission statement of his life's work. The mission statement of Klal Yisrael is the Nivrachu v'cha kol mishpachos adam. Anybody asks you what is the mission statement of the Jewish people, these 5 words are pretty close. The Nivrachu v'cha kol mishpachos adam. Through you, all the nations of the world will be blessed. And that is really, I think, the original idea of what we often refer to as a Kiddush Hashem. A Kiddush Hashem means that you're doing something which, when onlookers see it, they think that's magnificent. That's wonderful. That's something worthy of praise, worthy of valuing. And that is to bring blessing to the world. In what way does Avraham Avinu bring blessing to the world? So I think the first answer is through teaching Emunah. That's the first answer. But it's much more than that, of course. He's not just teaching Emunah, he's teaching Chesed. And in actual fact, throughout world history, there's no question that the value system of Klal Yisrael filtered through into civilization worldwide. The value, for example, of education begins, there's no question that Klal Yisrael are the first nation in the world to value, to have a national, systematic educational system. That everybody has to be learned and learning and teaching, and that there should be learning and teaching going on between parents and children and in the community. That value of education is something which is definitely a blessing, which came originally from Avraham Avinu, from the Torah. The value of philanthropy, of tzedakah and chesed, is also a blessing. Right? The blessing of Avraham Avinu is the idea that it's a worthy activity to be involved in chesed. In the pagan world, chesed was not valued at all. In the pagan world, it was egocentric and violent. And the whole idea of chesed was considered, on the contrary, somebody who engaged in chesed was weak, wasn't strong. Avraham Avinu developed this idea that chesed is a sign of strength. It's a sign of greatness. It's a sign of power, right? And these are all blessings from Klal Yisrael into civilization. And of course, lots of other blessings, right? The Jewish people have, lots of Jews have brought blessings of medicines and wisdom and understanding and science and culture, all sorts of different issues, right? The value of family life was definitely something, the idea of the sanctity of the family life, right? The bris nisuin, the covenant between a husband and wife within which they brought up children, right? This is something which is also can be traced back to the idea, to Klal Yisrael, to the Jewish people, right? The absolute restrictions against, say, adultery and incest and these sort of things were considered to be unheard of in the ancient world. On the contrary, some of the greatest Egyptian kings and pagan leaders were openly incestuous, as were the Roman emperors. And they lived incestuous lives and adulterous lives openly and proudly. And they felt that that was something to be praised. Klal Yisrael have always had, right? Kamaisa Eretz Mitzrayim lo ta'asu, the pasuk says. Do not live like the Mitzrayim lived, and not like the Canaanites lived. And what is it referring to? It's referring to sexual morality. The sexual immorality in the pagan world, in the non-Jewish world, and even to this day, the sexual immorality in the non-Jewish world sets us aside completely. I remember personally when I was in University of London, and I got very friendly with quite a lot of the other students in the philosophy department of UCL, London University. And we had a lot in common. We read the same books, we went to the same lectures, we discussed various things. We had a similar life in many ways, except when it came to the area of promiscuity, right? Their life was completely a million miles away from my life. And they didn't get it. They didn't understand. And we often had discussions about this. I remember sitting with a few of them. You know, there was about a dozen of the students who were all friendly with each other, the boys and the girls. And often they would go away for a weekend and rent a cottage somewhere in the countryside for a weekend. And basically for a couple of days, live like rabbits, right? And that was great fun. And that was student life. And they invited me to come along and join. And I tried to explain to them that basically my life was lived completely differently in this area. And they couldn't understand it. They didn't understand why not. In my second year of university, they understood it a bit better because I got married in my second year of university, and they thought that was unbelievable. They didn't know anybody. Not only were they not married, my fellow students, they weren't even thinking of getting married, and they didn't even know anybody who got married. I mean, it was like being a Martian. It was like, and then in my third year in university, we had our first baby, and that blew them all away completely. Totally blew them away. Nobody had any babies. Nobody had anything. But even the lecturers, the professors, were very impressed. And they had a student who got married and had a baby during his undergraduate degree. They thought this was unbelievable. They thought this was something completely from a different planet. And at the time, I didn't understand why. For me, it was the most normal and natural thing to do. I was 24 years old at the time, and that was a perfectly normal, natural thing to do. It's true, I'd been in Yeshiva Gedola for 7 years already after high school. So I was on a different, my mind was on a different plane maybe, but I enjoyed their company and I enjoyed the discussions. I enjoyed the philosopher discussions and study. But when it came to this area of sexual morality, we were on a different planet. Probably it's the only area where really we were on a different planet. Because in all other areas, they were very kind, they were very friendly, very intelligent, very, very understanding, very civilized. But in this area, they were on a different planet. They were not living on the same planet that I was living on at all. And I found that very striking. And I found that very, 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 very interesting. So this comes back to the point that Judith made before, that what was Avram teaching them? Right? What was the big revolution that he was teaching them? So he was teaching them the 7 Noachide laws, but part of the 7 Noachide laws is sexual morality and family life, right? And the restrictions against adultery, incest, and promiscuity. And that was something which was completely and utterly unheard of. And yet that was part of his message. And that was part of, so that's what I'm finishing off with today. These few words. The Nivrachu v'cha kol mishpachos Adam. The 5 words which Avraham Avinu is told in the very beginning. Your mission statement in life is to be the carrier of a bracha to mankind, a bracha which takes many forms, whether the bracha, both in the area of emunah, of chesed, in terms of philanthropy, education, family life, science, whatever it is, that bracha carries from Avraham Avinu, and therefore Lech Lecha is really the beginning of Jewish history, and everything beforehand is prehistoric. And I think that's it for today. What do you say, Eli? We're at the end of the Shia. I hope you've enjoyed this Shia, a bit of an introduction. And next week, I'm going to read with you a little bit of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi.
Oh, sorry.
You don't hear him. We don't. The rabbi's muted.
Okay, everybody now can unmute
Rabbi,
themselves. Yes,
Rabbi,
yes.
I must say this based on what you said, because I saw teachings. This is not mine. This is Rabbi Victor Miller. And he says in very strong language that the whole institution of university it's a hard thing to swallow, because we believe in the education and everything, but the whole institution of university and sending boys and girls to university it's breeding promiscuity.
Yes.
And premarital sex, and that's what and everything. So this is the downside of the enlightened educational system that the Goyim started. It's all wrapped into what you were teaching today.
You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. And that's why when and if we send our kids to university, they have to be well protected. Again, they have to be well informed that they're going into a place where there's a lot to learn there in universities, a lot of good ideas there and skills worth learning. But they got to know that they're walking into a context of promiscuity.
Yeah, den of iniquity. That's
for some people, this is not so easy.